many people looking at the modern Labour Party, today's Labour Party, and Miliband's Labour Party, say that it looks very much like it's reverting to a kind of statist perspective. This does seem to be a project which views almost every problem that the state needs to solve through more regulation, through more spending, through extending its reach in various ways. Are you concerned that there is a kind of resurgent statism, but perhaps it never left in the modern Labour project?
Yes, I'm very concerned. I think it's a tragedy. I don't think your characterisation of Ed Miliband is entirely fair, but I think that is the dominant sound, the dominant part of the music, as it were, that comes out of the Labour Party, certainly. And it's essentially changing society from the top down. And it's based on the belief that social change can only be procured by a strong state, strongly governed state, which produces a programme, presents it to the electorate, wins an election on that basis, and then carries it out. I mean, the paradigm of this, of course, was the Attlee government from 1945 to 51. And that is a sort of myth about the Attlee government, which has remained somehow floating around in the psyche of the Labour Party ever since. Of course, none of the other Labour governments that we've had in this country have been remotely as successful as the Attlee government. But that doesn't matter. It's somehow the attitude, well, you know, we perhaps didn't do as well as Attlee did, but that's the right course to follow. I think that's still there in the DNA of the Labour Party. Well, I think the Attlee government, I'm a great fan of the Attlee government. I grew up under the Attlee government. If people talked about Thatcher's children, well, I'm one of Attlee's children in that sense. But those days have gone. In a way, the Attlee government had a clean slate. And the changes that subsequent Labour governments have tried to carry out are far more complicated in a way. It's not that difficult to nationalise basic industries, to set up the National Health Service, and so on. It involved a lot of very hard work and courageous battles, but it wasn't, so to speak, intellectually, conceptually difficult. Whereas the problems confronted by the Wilson government in the 60s and 70s and the Blair-Brown regime in the 1990s and the early noughties were very difficult. And I think there was a kind of gap between perception and reality.
One last question for me before I open it up to the floor. One of the things that seems to be missing from the book is that something has happened in the last 10 years which we didn't expect to happen. So if you were been sitting here 10 or 15 years ago, we'd assumed that crime would carry on rising, that other certain kind of social pathologies, different kind of things would, the young people would drink more, be taking more drugs, there'd be a continued rise in teenage pregnancy, etc. But in fact, what some people call the social recession seems to have reversed. Crime is down, violent crime is down, young people are drinking less, taking fewer drugs, teenage pregnancy levels are down. Now, what do you think that's about? Is it society correcting itself? Is it, as it were, people may not understand your ideas, but in a sense, is society recognising that path of what you describe as the trinity of individualism, freedom and choice has come to the end of the road? Or is it just a blip?
I don't know. Obviously not. I mean, maybe it is a blip, but I recognise it, and it's a pretty big blip if it's a blip. I think probably, yes, you're right. It is a sort I'm a great fan, as you'll see if I can persuade you to buy and read the book, or you can read it even if you don't buy it. What I want you to do is read it. You'll see that I'm a great fan of the Hungarian thinker Karl Polanyi. And Polanyi believed that the story of the 19th century was really a story of a very assertive state imposing laissez-faire on a much older society in a very ruthless kind of way. Right? But there was a reaction against that. And the history of the 19th century is, according to him, the history of society, so to speak, reasserting itself against this prison house of laissez-faire. Now, it may be that this story is being repeated now. I mean, if you want to think of a comparison, I mean, Thatcher is the equivalent, if you look at it in that perspective, Thatcher is the equivalent of the harsh, repressive state of the early 19th century, imposing laissez-faire on the population. And what's happening now may be the 21st century equivalent of what happened, according to Polanyi, in the second half of the 19th century. It could be. But it's still the case that inequality in this country is still the highest of the developed countries of Europe. And many of the pathologies...
But it's not as if we're not talking about it.
It's not as though we're not talking about it, but we're not doing much about it. And it's not very easy to do anything about it anyway.
I guess the point is, David, that 15 years ago it was okay to say inequality was... You didn't even talk about it, that it was a dead concept. Whereas now people across the political spectrum, well, they'll argue about the best response to inequality, but they won't argue that inequality doesn't matter or that it isn't there.
I wonder. I'm not so sure about that. I think it is, I mean, in this respect, our criticism of the Labour Party of Ed Miliband needs to be tempered, because he clearly does recognise this. He hasn't discovered the way to solve the problem, but all of this rather complicated stuff about pre-distribution is his attempt to tackle that problem, which shows that he does recognise it, I think. And of course Obama recognises it in the much more inegalitarian society of the United States. I'm not so sure that I see very much sign of it on the political right in this country, though.
Well, that's a good point to open up to the floor. Maybe there'll be people from the political right who can joust with you on that particular topic. So let's open it up to the room. There are people writing notes to me in the front. So ask a question while I read the note. Very good. Yes.
If they can stand up.
If you could stand up and shout when you speak, because we've got the microphones. No, actually, you know, I'm going to walk. I'm going to be the mic. I've done this before. I'm going to be the mic person. First time I've ever done this. So excited. There we are. Say your name and fire away.
Good afternoon. My name is Ivor Hopkins. Given that our political situation is probably broken, is the time right for a benign dictatorship?
Apparently this isn't working, so the whole thing is a total farce. Anyway, over to you, David.
I think the trouble with benign dictatorships is they don't stay benign very long. I'm afraid I think the nearest thing we had to a benign dictatorship, I suppose, was in World War II, and that was pretty benign. There were some revolts against it, you know, when Churchill was Prime Minister. But still, that was a very exceptional situation where a united country was fighting for its life and fighting for a cause too, the destruction of Nazism. But no, I think the vision of benign dictatorship, you know, it's a tragedy. Think of the Middle East. Think of the Arab Spring and what's happened, what we're now seeing in Egypt. It's not benign. It doesn't stay benign. The danger is more the other way around, that formerly democratic regimes are led by what I call charismatic populists who almost like to think, I don't think they put it in these words, but are in a way trying to be benign dictators. And in the end, it all ends in horrible disillusionment and mess. So, no, not a benign dictatorship, please.
But I guess, David, that links into the question of the possibility of democratic reform. That, you know, if the choice was really between the American federal democratic system and the Chinese governmental system, I think a lot of people would say, well, at least in China, you know, they kind of stick to things for a few years and there's rationality, even if it's in the interest of the party bosses, whereas America just feels like a profoundly dysfunctional and broken system. So, doesn't part of this story, which I don't think you touched on that, we do touch on in the book, but is about the possibility of reviving our democratic spirit, but there doesn't seem to be much sign of that at the moment.
Well, I'm not so sure. In the last chapter of the book, I have a section which I call slightly, you can see that I'm not quite sure of myself, intimations of a challenge, I call it. And I mention a series of the Green Movement, particularly this marvellous, charismatic lady, Polly Higgins, who campaigns for what she calls a law of ecocide. Ecocide being the destruction of natural systems to such a point that the security of the population is endangered. And she wants to have a law making ecocide illegal. This is an astonishingly interesting proposal, I think. It's not properly worked out how it would happen and so on. That remains to be discussed. But the Green Movement is an example, I think, of a grassroots welling up of a desire for profound change. I think an organisation called Compass, which I have to admit I belong to, so I should declare an interest, is an example of another kind of grassroots organisation, which is trying to push us on a different course. I think the Occupy movement was an example of that too. And this UK citizens and London citizens, is a sort of branch of UK citizens campaigning for a living wage. These are all, I think, these are all movements for change which are, in a way, which are bypassing the channels of conventional parties and conventional policy making. They may fizzle out. Nothing may come of it. But I think these are very hopeful signs of what our society is now like. And we should be trying, so to speak, to nurture these, and maybe, when it's appropriate, be a critical friend to these, but certainly not to brush them under the carpet. And one of the most depressing things, I think, here I do agree with you about your critique of Miliband and the Labour Party, they don't seem, to me, really to have taken on board that this is happening. And if they really want to change society, not by decree from the centre, but from the bottom up, this is who they should be talking to, and this is whose insights they should be drawing upon. But anyway, in that way, I'm really quite optimistic.
Okay, let's take the lady at the back of the room. She had to shout out.
Sorry, my name's Jenny. I actually run one of the organisations we've just been talking about, which is mainly run by young people. So I just wanted to pick up on Matthew's question about is this a blip with young people becoming quite moral in their outlooks. And if you look at the figures, there are many more young people joining those sorts of societies, volunteering, being active, but they are really disillusioned with formal sort of politics. So that's a comment. A question is, I actually think that is what David Miliband on the right tried to do with the big society.
David Cameron, not David Miliband.
Sorry. He did try to do that, but it went horribly wrong. And I see a lot of other politicians trying to resurrect that. And I wonder if you have any views about why that went wrong and how politics can get that right to encourage it.
I think I just want to confirm, I think this is a really interesting question, because I've been involved in all sorts of conversations with people at different parts of the political spectrum about what needs to happen. And there is a recurrent thing, which you'd have the conversation, you come up with something, you say, and someone says, yeah, but that sounds just like the big society. And people go, that's been done. And it didn't work. So, exactly as you say, there was something in the big society which people thought, yes, this is onto something, but then so what do we learn from that, though?
I think one of the things we learn is the extraordinary difficulty facing anyone who is actually, so to speak, managing, ruling the British state at moving in that kind of direction. Because I'm not a fan of David Cameron's, I I'm afraid. Although there was a time, and I was, at the beginning of after he was elected leader of the Conservative Party, I thought he was a good Burkean Whig.
But you do tend to like politicians when they start out, and then,
Well,
you're kind of like, you always like the first album, but then,
Well, that's because they let me down. No, but anyway, I think you've got to face it that being in charge of this machine, the machine of the British state, you're in charge of something which has very, very, very deeply centralist reflexes all through, and you're in charge of, not least, Her Majesty's Treasury, which is a department that sees the outside world as sort of partly composed of savages and partly composed of enemies. And indeed, the savages are enemies from the point of view of the Treasury. And trying to get that machine to think in a different kind of way is astonishingly difficult. And I think that's probably the reason why the big society came to naught. And probably also weaknesses if you like, in Cameron's personality. You've got to remember that Cameron started his career as a public relations man. And he's still that, in a way. A large part of him is still that. He's very, very good at thinking up slogans and sort of, performing in the ridiculous cockpit of the House of Commons. He does that very well. But he's not a deep thinker, I don't think, and I'm not sure. So, I don't know, is the answer. But I think it's something to do with the way the British state operates, is the fundamental problem, and the great problem facing us as we look to the future is how we can have a really, so to speak, rescue local government from its status as the humiliated Cinderella of British governments, which is, I think, the phrase I put in the book, and give it sort of constitutionally entrenched powers, whereas, of course, what's actually happened has been that government after government after government has been whittling away the powers and functions of local government. I'm astonished, actually, that there are still very good people in local government. I mean, I view them as sort of saints, because there they are, doing their best, with virtually no powers. But it still attracts good people.
Okay, let's take 2 or 3 questions together. In fact, there's a little nest of 3 questions there. So jump up and shout out your question. Keep it brief if you can.
My name is Paul Tobias. Does society benefit more from coalition government, or does it benefit more from strong single-party majority governments?
Okay, hold on to that, though. Yep.
David, hi, Philip Goldenberg. Apart from disagreeing with you on Thatcher and the Church of England, imposing George Carey is one of the best bits of institutional sabotage ever devised, can I ask you, how worried are you, how worried should we be that with the rise of UKIP, who are supported by angry old men, we've had the intellectual analysis, you're actually moving from the politics where the dividing line is primarily economic to the politics where the dividing line is significantly social, with very nasty right-wing populism and the sort of stuff you get in the States.
Okay, and then next to you.
Brian Pierce, I was interested in the comments you've been making about the political context, but I'm even more interested in the fact that you've called the subject that you're tackling Britain's moral crisis rather than Britain's political crisis. And you spoke earlier about political and religious dimensions of this, and I wondered if you could perhaps expand a little on the reason why you see it as a moral crisis and what you think needs to be done about that.
So I think the second and third questions go together, but do you want to just deal with the first one first, which is your view of coalitionary government?
Well, I think it was Disraeli who said England does not love coalitions. He said this, I mean, Disraeli is full of wonderful one-liners, which sort of reverberate through history. I'm not sure that he meant them all terribly seriously, but still. I used to think that, if you like, the German model was much better than ours. If you have a system in which the legislature is elected effectively by proportional representation in one form or another, you're almost bound to have coalition government. And I think on the whole the German system has worked astoundingly well in the post-war period. I mean, my God, this is a miracle, actually. This was the country that was sort of disturbing the peace of Europe for a very long time, suddenly become a model citizen, actually, as well as being a very successful economy. So, in a way, coalition government is, I think, better than strong single-party government. The trouble is, you probably think I'm harping on this too much. The trouble is, the wretched civil service can't operate with coalition government. It's very interesting. If you look back at the beginning of this government, this coalition, there's a very good book about this by a friend of mine, Vernon Bogdanor, called The Coalition and the Constitution. I should be saying my own book, not his, but anyway, shows I'm generous. And he shows, I think, that the civil service treated the coalition agreement as though it was a party election manifesto which had been voted for by the electorate. And they treated the coalition as though it was a single-party government, which of course it's not. And it became, partly for that reason, and partly because of the way the House of Commons works and because of the way British politicians have been socialised, it is very, very difficult to accept that a coalition government is a government of more than one, by definition, of more than one party, and they don't agree all the time, and they don't have to agree all the time. And they have their own agendas and their own philosophies which are different. And that's what coalition means. It's almost as though we can't get used to the idea of a genuine coalition government. And now I think a lot of the problems of poor old Clegg are actually due to that neither the Conservatives nor Clegg himself have actually appreciated that a coalition government doesn't have to sing, all the members of it don't have to sing, and shouldn't have to sing from the same hymn sheet. That's been our problem. Now, I forget what the second question was. The second was so profound.
Well, I think both these questions are about kind of new fault lines, in a sense. So the second question is, are we moving to a world where what really divides people is culture and social values rather than economic position? But that's also related to the fact that your book is about a moral crisis, not just a political crisis.
Yes, I see. Well, I regarded it as a crisis of what I call the moral economy, right? By which I mean, and it's very hard to get this across, and I'm probably not going to do it now either. By which I mean the nexus of assumptions, values, inherited beliefs, etc., that tell economic actors how they ought to behave, right? That's what I call the moral economy. And I think the crisis of 2007, 2008 was a crisis of the moral economy as well as of the political economy, if you like. And that crisis, the crisis of the moral economy, I believe, has not been resolved. Economic actors still don't know how they ought to behave. And that's what's so fascinating, actually, about the present moment. Because here we have the governor of the Bank of England telling economic actors in big firms very loud and clear that they should not be behaving in the way they are. And that when, I can't remember the exact words he used, but something like, when belief in the market becomes a dogma, a faith beyond rational dispute, you're going to be in trouble. Words to that effect. You're going to be in dire trouble. And I think that's true. And I think in that sense, it's in that particular sense that I think the moral crisis hasn't been resolved and needs to be. And that's why I'm calling in the book for a new public philosophy, which would try to do that.
And Philip's question about are we moving towards an Americanization of British politics, where it's issues like culture, religion, race, social attitudes which determine the fault lines rather than class and economic status?
Well, in the first place, I don't think it's true that American politics is quite that simple.
That was what I said, not what he said, in fairness.
Yeah. I mean, I think the subtext of an awful lot of what appear to be cultural is actually economic. And Joe Sixpack, you remember, who figured very loudly or largely in the run-up to the Democratic Convention, from which which made Obama the candidate. Joe Sixpack was a working-class American blue-collar worker who was being screwed, actually. And you've only got to look at the way in which the distribution of income in America has gone over the past recent decades to see that. So maybe people put their economic grievances in a cultural way. It doesn't mean to say the economic grievances don't exist. They do. And I think one of the most interesting things about Obama now, you might say, well, okay, he's only got another 2 years. Well, it's a bit late in the day, isn't it? But still, he is actually quite explicitly trying to address the problem of inequality in America. So, as I said, in Britain, I think on the other hand, of course, America is a much more multicultural society than this one, almost by definition. Multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-whatever. And there's a very, very big difference between San Francisco and Detroit, let's say, in culture as well as in economic outlook. We don't have anything like the same diversity in this country, but we do have a lot of more diversity than we used to. And I guess that in the panic about immigration and the panic about Islam, you can see a kind of echo of the American situation, but it's a pretty faint echo compared to what exists in the States, I believe.
Okay, let's take another cluster of questions. There's a gentleman here in a cap.
Hi, my name's Godfrey.
We've actually got a microphone now.
Hi, my name's Godfrey, and at the very beginning you mentioned a little bit about technology, and I was wondering how you see the role of technology, and in particular sort of the transparency that's enabled from technology, how you see that as playing a role in fixing the moral crisis.
Okay, well, let's hold on to that one. Yep.
I don't think the microphone's working, is it?
It is working. It is working now. It's now working. Yep.
Oh, right. I'm Derek Bates. I'm a consulting scientist. You talk about financial and moral decline, and I haven't read your book yet, but I will. I wonder how important you feel that the book in 1976 by Jensen and Meckling, which is a theory of the firm, in which they instigated the process whereby managers of companies got big shares in the company, and this has precipitated, in the view of many economists, the 2007-2008 crisis.
Okay, great. So, and then there's a gentleman over there, if you can kind of pass it. Oh, very good view. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Bruce Davis, and I study markets and money, and I was just wondering on the question of the moral economy, and Carney's statements yesterday, Tuesday, which were kind of interesting, about ethics and the markets, isn't the moral economy, isn't it just the market? That we've separated the two things, and actually they're the same thing, i.e. it's a moral market. The idea that's created the moral crisis is the idea that the market doesn't have a morality, it's about natural selection or competition without morality, because that somehow blinds you from the truth that you should aim for profit. But in reality, you can create moral markets because they exist all the time. You look at a building society, it doesn't eat itself. You look at eBay, actually, it doesn't eat itself. But we seem to think that markets should operate as if everybody should eat everybody, and winner takes all, and society picks up the tab. So, I mean, is it actually the case that we've separated morality from markets, rather than, and we should actually be talking about moral markets, and that perhaps would help Carney find his solution that he can't find?
Very good. I think these questions they're very different, but they're kind of similar notions in a sense. Moral markets, moral firms, and kind of moral technology, as it were. How is morality embedded in these different things, and how do they impact on morality?
I think the question about technology, can I go back to that? I'm not sure that I remember it now fully, but what I think is fascinating is the interaction between technology and culture. I think I tend to be not a technological determinist. I don't think technology determines everything. I think technologies, the technological innovations, in order to be actually put into practice, the scientific discovery, the process by which that becomes an actual technology which is actually working in the real world, is partly cultural. And the classic example of this, of course, often cited, is that the Chinese, way before Europe, invented gunpowder, paper, all sorts of things, but they never really developed the modern scientific revolution and technological revolution that followed in Europe, even though they were in many ways the pioneers. And why was that? Because a whole series of cultural attitudes inherited from the past. Now, in this country, or Western countries, I think the same is true. A German economist, sociologist and economist, Wolfgang Streeck by name, had a very interesting insight on this, which I've never forgotten, which was the following. Have you ever asked yourself why it is that American washing machines are very simple, and all you've got to do is press a button and whoosh, the washing machine works? Whereas in Europe, washing machines are very complicated. You have a whole load of different options which you can use. In the same sort of way, Americans love automatic gear shifts, whereas Europeans like to have, a traditional gear that they can actually hold in their hand. It's interesting to ponder that. Why should these equally developed parts of the world have these different approaches to technology? And I think the answer has got something to do, in the case of washing machines and in the case of cars, it's got something to do with the feeling of being in control. And maybe Europeans don't feel as happy as Americans do to let technology, so to speak, go breezing along without any control by them. I don't know why that is, but it does seem to be a cultural difference, and it doesn't only apply to Britain and France, it applies right across European countries.
Take these, we're running out of time. I'm just going to connect the answer to the question, because I think what is interesting in line with what you said is that attitudes to the role that technology can play in transparency seem to vary enormously from country to country, depending upon the cultural mores of that country. So I think that's actually another example of exactly what you're talking about. You raise the point of transparency and the different types of debates taking place about scrutiny and security and privacy and all those kinds of things. Anyway, firms and markets, to finish off with, David.
Can there be moral markets? Are there? I'm not quite sure. I understood where you were coming from, but that doesn't matter.
But markets will naturally be places where people behave morally, that they will be a balance of competition and collaboration, but that we have developed a particular view of markets, which is that they are just places of acquisition. Is that right?
I think that's right, yes. Well, thank you. Yes, I agree very much with that. And I think the great thinker, I'm about to know one in my admiration of him, Friedrich Hayek, has a lot to answer for, because he thought all of this sort of talk, social justice, he said, is a mirage. All that there is competition. That will produce, by definition, the best possible outcome, because markets are rational, consumers in the marketplace are rational creatures, and therefore, and they have knowledge, foresight, etc., blah, blah, blah. And therefore, the market will produce, undistorted, unregulated, uninterfered with, will produce the best possible outcome. And, said Hayek, and this was hugely influential on Mrs. Thatcher, quite obviously, there was a famous occasion when she slapped a copy of Hayek's Constitution of Liberty on somebody's desk, presumably a quivering civil servant, probably, and said, "This is what we believe." The Hayekian picture is just wrong, actually, I think. Just wrong. And, of course, you're right. Market actors do operate. This is what I mean by the notion of a moral economy. They do operate according to various principles which you can call moral. But what we've, in the backwash of the Hayekian revolution, we've kind of brushed that under the carpet.
And then finally onto firms, and this is just a final point, this links to a broader theme, which is the decay of institutions. Institutions which, and actually I don't think you talk about this much in the book, but the firm, it seems to me, is a classic example of this, of an institutional form which wasn't really understood and has been allowed to turn into something very different to what its historical role was supposed to be. I mean, firms were supposed to represent a balance of long-term stewardship, not just a kind of place for holding assets and maximising shareholder return.
Well, this gets us into this debate which went on, I was involved in it a bit, along with Will Hutton, my dear friend, back in the 90s, the notion of stakeholder capitalism, where what you wanted was firms which, yes, they were accountable to their shareholders, certainly, but they weren't only accountable to their shareholders. Their sole duty was not just to maximise shareholder value. They were also supposed, in the model of stakeholder capitalism, they were also supposed to take account of the interests of other stakeholders, communities, suppliers, customers, etc., etc., etc. And the British version of capitalism, although it had traces of that stakeholder model, actually, if you go back to the 19th century, it did, in some parts, in some areas of economic activity. And you had people like the Cadburys, who were very good examples of a stakeholder approach to the running of a firm. But the majority feeling in this country, somehow, it just never took off here. When I think it was actually Will Hutton who did this. Tony Blair made a speech somewhere. I think it was in Singapore.
He did?
That's right. Before he became Prime Minister.
He made a speech in favour of stakeholder
That's
capitalism,
right.
and then someone rang up and explained what it meant.
What it meant.
And then Alistair Campbell said he didn't mean it.
Exactly. That's right. And I think, actually, in fairness to Blair, I think he probably did mean it when he said it. I think he did know more about it than he was letting on, than Campbell was letting on. But the point is, it's never taken off here. And I think, actually, this is a profound difference between the German famous Mittelstand and the British attitude to, well, actually, to the operation of markets and to the operations of market agents. This debate has been going on for a very long time, actually, in this country. But it's never got anywhere. Not yet. I think maybe, if you're right, Matthew, about the climate changing, and I was saying it was too, maybe it will come back. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I argue for in the book is you could actually, by changing company law, you could, if you wanted to, oblige a sort of stakeholder view, create the obligation on companies to adopt a stakeholder approach. You could do that if you wanted to. Now, if Miliband wasn't so scared of looking socialist, he might do that, but he hasn't yet.
Okay, that's a good point for us to end our conversations. All the themes that David has spoken about appear in the book. It's a wonderful read. As I say, you'll be kind of daunted by David's critique of the modern world, but also ultimately inspired by the possibility of change. Thank you all for the questions that you asked. Thank you for coping with the Spinal Tap-esque technological problems that we've had. The book's available outside. David will sign it, but can I just ask you to join me in thanking David Marquand?